Hi everyone, very warm welcome. We're going to begin the session now. This, of course, is the exciting talk on how to strengthen the Biological Weapons Convention and in specific an insider's perspective from the 9th Review Conference. I'm going to introduce our very amazing speakers. So first we have Ryan, who is a research assistant at the Institute of Microbiology and Infection at University of Birmingham. And he specializes in metagenomic pathogen surveillance. Before he was doing this project, he has also worked as a political affairs intern at the Biological Weapons Convention and was also part of the winning team of the 2022 Next Generation for Biosecurity competition. Ryan's professional background includes experience in healthcare analysis, public service, and a tenure at the combat medic in the Singapore Armed Forces Medical Corps. Ryan also holds a master's degree in applied mathematics for University of Warwick, which is the same one I went to, so I'm excited. Before that, he earned his bachelor's degree in statistics from the National University of Singapore with minors in public health and geographical information systems. The second very exciting speaker joining us today is Nils Justen, who is currently completing his engineering graduate degree at the Technical University of Munich while working as a research assistant at the Institute of Virology. In addition to his academic pursuits, Nils is a biosecurity fellow with the both Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security and also the Council for Strategic Risks. Prior to his current role, Nils has also interned at the Biological Weapons Convention in Geneva during the 9th Review Conference that happened last year. Before his time at the UN, he conducted biosecurity governance research at Stanford University and also served as an emerging technology intern at the US Environmental Protection Agency. Nils holds a bachelor's degree in mathematical engineering from Michigan Technological University, and very excitingly, he's an incoming executive branch fellow in the US government, and he will continue to focus on issues at the intersection of national security and biological threats. Quick reminder before I hand this over, we'll be accepting questions by swap cards, so please feel free to drop them in throughout the session, and we'll select a mixture of pre-selected and some of the most upvoted questions. Can we get a quick round of applause for our exciting speakers?
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, fellow participants, welcome to our presentation titled Strengthening the Biological Weapons Convention. My name is Nils, and I'm joined by my esteemed former UN desk partner, Ryan Teo. Together, we'll be sharing with you our insights and experiences from the previous 9th Review Conference. We'll be highlighting some crucial aspects of the convention, the historical context, as well as the recent review conference. A quick disclaimer before we start. The views and opinions expressed in this presentation are entirely our own, and they do not reflect those of our respective employers. With that out of the way, we're very excited for the opportunity to share with our experiences with you all today, and we want to thank you for joining us. Now, as we dive into this presentation, we'll be covering some key topics pertaining to the convention. We have made a conscious effort throughout this talk to present information that goes beyond readily available resources to give you all a unique behind-the-scenes perspective on the BWC. Now, in the first section, we'll provide an introduction to the Biological Weapons Convention. We'll look at questions like, what is the BWC, and why is it important? Why do some argue it's neglected? And in what context did it come into existence? In the second section, we'll offer a brief overview of the 9th Review Conference. What is its general role in advancing the convention? How did expectations for the 9th Review Conference change in the months leading up to it? And which initiatives were agreed and which ultimately failed? And then lastly, we'll talk about diplomacy and decision-making within the BWC. We'll discuss the inner workings of diplomacy and decision-making, what influences a given initiative's chance of success, and how negotiation strategies and personal dynamics shape outcomes. And with that, let's get started. Now, this first section will help us establish a solid understanding of the Biological Weapons Convention, its historical origins, and the broader context in which it operates. To understand the origin of this convention, it's important to appreciate that the threat of state-sponsored offensive biological weapons programs was and is real. And it's with this understanding that international efforts ultimately leading to a global disarmament treaty were undertaken. Now, major players like the United States and the Soviet Union have all conducted offensive biological weapons research and development, and by the end of World War II, it was generally clear that these weapons could effectively target plants, animals, and humans. In the Cold War era, with this realization in mind, Many nations around the world greatly expanded these efforts, and it was US President Richard Nixon's 1969 termination of the US biological weapons program that was one of the factors ultimately paving the way for adoption of the Biological Weapons Convention. Unfortunately, today concerns persist about the continuation of offensive biological weapons programs, particularly in Russia and North Korea. These are fueled by a non-disclosure of known past programs, questionable leadership statements, and active disinformation campaigns. And I'm gonna hand it off to Ryan.
Yeah, thanks. So the Biological Weapons Convention is a recognition that the use of biology as a weapon was repugnant to the conscience of mankind. At least that was what it was written in the Solemn Declaration. And it really looks beyond just the use of biological weapons, but also the production, acquisition, transfer, and stockpiling of dangerous agents, as well as the equipment needed to create it and also deliver these weapons. So it doesn't just look at use, which is what the Geneva Gas Protocol did initially. So what is the BWC? It's looking past the actual text of the convention. It's actually a really short treaty with only 15 articles, and the Wikipedia page, which was done by a previous intern, was actually pretty comprehensive, so I definitely recommend checking it out. But for this talk, here's what you need to know. The BWC is the first multilateral treaty to entirely prohibit an entire class of weapons of mass destruction. And this was negotiated during the height of the Cold War, which is quite admirable and quite, precious to have in the entire disarmament landscape. It has been signed and ratified by 185 states parties, and there are 8 countries that have yet to sign and ratify, but 4 countries have signed but have yet to ratify the convention. So this is by no means universal, although we are there are quite a lot of states parties that are party to the convention. The convention is split into, these 185 states parties are split into 4 regional groups. And initially, these started out as a group of 3, like the Western group, the Eastern European group, and the non-aligned movement. And these groups are largely remnants of the Cold War era, where there was clear divides ideologically between states parties. At the 9th Review Conference, Russia decided to leave the Eastern European group and formed its own group of 1. And that's why we have 4 regional groups right now. A feature of the BWC, like many multilateral decision-making fora and treaties, is that decision-making is consensus-based, meaning that every state has effectively like a veto power in decision-making. And this was initially meant to make decisions that are made by the convention legitimate and also inclusive, to make sure that everyone has a say in disarmament, which was very critical at the time. But I think recently it has been a reason why the BWC has not progressed, because it always has to cater to the lowest common denominator. The biggest, I think, shortcoming of the BWC is that it doesn't have a verification mechanism. What this means is that 185 states parties come together and say that biological weapons are bad. Yes. Then when it comes to the question of, can I make sure that you're not making biological weapons? They're all like, no. So there is no way to verify the compliance with the BWC. There were efforts made in the 1990s to negotiate a protocol and come up with a verification mechanism that was ultimately, the negotiations ultimately fell through because of opposition from the US. And yeah, instead of verification, what the treaty has are mechanisms that rely on confidence building and building trust among states parties. What this looks like are confidence building measures, which are a set of forms that countries are obligated to submit annually regarding biological activities that may be deemed sensitive, like the number and location of biosafety level 4 laboratories in different countries. So submitting confidence building measures is a sign of building trust and transparency among states parties. That by no means is a replacement for a verification mechanism, but it's better than having an environment where no one knows what each other is doing. Yeah.
Thanks. So let's now consider why the BWC is important in the governance of global GCBRs. Here I want to talk about 2 reasons specifically. The first is upholding a global taboo. the BWC plays a critical role in reinforcing the global norm against the development, stockpiling, and use of biological weapons. The confidence-building measures that Ryan just mentioned help to avoid escalation spirals and misunderstandings among states parties. The second is that the BWC serves as a vehicle for a unified response. It serves as a forum for dialogue and brings together a diverse group of actors from states parties and technical experts to civil society to discuss international security and disarmament topics. It facilitates communication even in tense geopolitical environments among countries like China, Russia, and the United States. It's important to acknowledge, however, that despite its importance, many people consider the treaty in its current framework to be a relatively weak framework. And this is primarily due to the lack of a verification mechanism. So what challenges does the BWC face? Well, firstly, the BWC is understaffed and underfunded. The convention does not receive funding from the UN's general budget, but instead relies on about $2 million of voluntary contributions from states parties to fund its 4 staff members. This complicates the BWC's ability to fund initiatives and just keep operations running, frankly. Secondly, there's limited participation by states parties. This is reflected in the number of CBM report submissions, which just peaked over 50% for the first time in 2021 as a fraction of states parties. Now, this lack of engagement translates into limited participation at official meetings. Now, some states simply lack the resources to regularly send diplomats to Geneva, but I would argue that a second reason is the historical absence of a major offensive use of biological weapons, which leads to a failure of imagination by some to appreciate the broader magnitude of the threat. And thirdly, the BWC faces increasingly complex threats. This includes increasing access to biotechnology, convergence with other fields like AI and nanotechnology, and an increasing need to cooperate with other international entities like the Chemical Weapons Convention and the World Health Organization. Now, these challenges all contribute to an environment where progress is slow and incremental. But it's critical to address these weaknesses to ensure the continued effectiveness and relevance of the convention. And with that, I'll hand it over to Ryan to talk about the recent review conference.
Thanks. Yeah, so the bulk of our talk really revolves around the 9th review conference, which was an event that happened last year from November to December, and it lasted over 3 weeks. And it is the biggest BWC event to happen in the last 7 or so years from the 8th review conference that happened in 2016. So Nils and I were very fortunate to be part of the 2 of the 4 interns supporting the team that at the time had only 3 people. So the interns outnumbered like the actual staff. And we're happy to share our experiences and our expectations leading up to the conference. So a bit of background about what a review conference actually is and what is its role. The review conference is built into the BWC as a mechanism to review the operation of the convention at regular intervals of time, and to ensure that the purposes of the preamble and the provisions are being realized. Which means to say, every 5 years, states parties meet and they look back at the last 5 years and see what is wrong with the treaty, what needs to be updated, and what interpretations need to be made. Apart from that, they also set the agenda for the intersessional program, and this refers to the subsequent 5 years. So between the current review conference and the next review conference, if there is one, what actions will be taken to strengthen the treaty, and what new proposals will be taken up to strengthen the convention. Yeah. Some states, or like many states, interpret the review conference as the only legally binding decision-making body outside of special conferences. What this means is that if states want to collectively make a decision to change the treaty, this can only happen at review conferences. So this effectively means that the window for updating the treaty happens only every 5 years, which is why the BWC the pace of progress remains very slow when it comes to amending or improving the BWC. It's also interesting to note that review conferences for the BWC are very important because the technical secretariat that's composed of now 4 people has to be renewed at every review conference because they don't have an indefinite term. So it's important for the review conference to come to a consensus about a final outcome that includes extending the term of the Secretariat. Otherwise, if there's no final decision, there may not even be a decision to hold a 10th review conference. There may not be a Secretariat to organize the meetings that happen in between the 9th and whatever happens after that. Yeah. So to understand our expectations leading up to the 9th review conference, I think it's interesting to put ourselves back in early 2022. And if we are back in 2022, the biggest thing on our minds would be the COVID-19 pandemic, which has shown us the vulnerabilities in the global health system and showed us how devastating biological threats can be. And I think for most of us, we believe that this has spurred states parties to be more mindful about ways to strengthen the biological convention meaningfully. And I think it sort of showed the urgency of having to improve the convention. And at the time, the biggest opportunity to strengthen the convention was at the 9th review conference, initially scheduled for August 2022. In November 2021, the US finally signaled a willingness to discuss compliance issues and verification, and this was a topic that was not discussed or it was even considered taboo to discuss for the last 20 years after negotiations fell through in 2001. So the fact that the US signaled a willingness to reopen talks on compliance and verification in 2021 was very exciting. And if we were all back in January 2022, we would be very excited about the 9th review conference and what it means when it comes to opportunities to strengthen the convention. Unfortunately, in February 2022, Russia has decided to invade a sovereign neighbor of Ukraine, and that has really soured geopolitical relations and led to a lot of distrust among states parties, which is not a very conducive environment for consensus building. At the preparatory committee meeting for the 9th review conference in April, many states widely condemned Russia's actions, and that sort of was a preview for the amount of disruption that we were prepared for at the 9th review conference, which was also postponed to December to give more time for the president of the RevCon to prepare. During this time, Russia launched a disinformation campaign aimed at allegations about US-funded activities in Ukrainian biolaboratories that could be deemed as non-compliant of the non-compliance of the BWC. In September, they activated Article 5 of the BWC, which called for a formal consultative meeting, meaning all states parties come together to discuss these allegations and hopefully come to a conclusion. This is significant because Article 5 was only the second time in history that Article 5 was activated. The first time was in 1997. There was no outcome to this final meeting. They couldn't reach a consensus, and Russia activated Article 6 of the BWC, which was for the first time in history. And Article 6 calls for an investigation by the UN Security Council if a resolution passes. And the resolution did not pass a vote by the UN Security Council, and so there was no investigation involved. And to Russia, these allegations about the US-funded biolabs in Ukraine remain unanswered, and they stated that they would continue to bring this issue up at the 9th review conference. And so, to summarize this very long slide, initially we were very hopeful about the 9th review conference, but towards the end we were preparing for a worst-case scenario. So what are the specific outcomes? I think if I were to summarize the specific outcomes of the review conference, I would summarize in 3 points. The first one was participation, and this was very encouraging. Since the 8th review conference, I think about a handful of new countries joined the convention. So there was greater participation by states, but among NGOs and intergovernmental organizations, we also seen greater participation at the review conference. And I think this reflects a greater interest and greater urgency in strengthening the convention. And we also saw greater female participation, and we had the largest youth delegate turnout. And Nils and I were happy to be part of the team that organized the youth delegates to draft a set of recommendations for the 9th review conference. And these recommendations were presented to the president of the review conference. And yeah, he had some thoughts about it. Yeah. The very positive outcome is that states were able to come to a consensus about a final outcome. And part of that final outcome was continuation. So they scheduled a 10th review conference in 2027, and they've also extended the term of the implementation support unit, which was originally 3 people, and now they've decided to add 1 staff member. So a 33% increase in staffing, which is very impressive. So there's continuation, and the last point I wanted to write action, but I added in at the start because this is still questionable. The main takeaway from the review conference final document was the establishment of a working group to strengthen the convention. And what this means is that states parties will continue to come together over the next 4 years to discuss ways to strengthen the convention. And I realized in this presentation I said strengthen the convention many times, and probably is very opaque about what that actually means. But the agenda for the working group contains these 7 points. And I apologize to people at the back who, for this font size is a bit small, but this chart shows the 7 items on the working group's agenda and the number of meeting days that they allocate to each item. And unsurprisingly, the agenda of international cooperation and assistance, as well as scientific and technological developments, are given the most priority, or have the highest priority. And these are issues that have been discussed at the BWC for many, many years and continue to receive the highest priorities. And there was some momentum to build mechanisms for international cooperation and to review science and tech developments in the past to ensure that the treaty remains updated. And for something that's negotiated in 1972, I'm sure biology has changed somewhat from then to now. I think what's notable about this is that the working group now includes an agenda item on verification. And this is a very big breakthrough because verification, like I said before, has not been discussed at a BWC meeting for the last 2 decades. And the fact that this has been allowed to be an item on the working group agenda, and is also on the same level as previous, more mature topics like cooperation and science and tech, I think it shows a step towards meaningful strengthening of the convention. And I think this is why I added the in front of the action, was because a lot of this is just meetings. It remains to be seen how much these meetings actually translate to actual policy and actual strengthening. And Nils and I felt like there were a lot of missed opportunities with the conference. The first is that there was no article-by-article review, and this is the component of a final document that usually looks back at the last 5 years and adds some interpretation or keeps the treaty updated. And because they couldn't reach a consensus, this entire section of the final document was removed, which means that the Biological Weapons Convention has not been updated since 2016. And from 2016 to now, the Article 5 has been activated, Article 6 has been activated. These are very historical events, not even counting like the global pandemic. So a global pandemic happened, the Biological Weapons Convention has not changed to reflect that. And recommendations we found were not as robust as expected. If you were in the room when negotiations happened in the second last day, you would be able to see what the final document looked like. And if you scan this QR code, it's like a 30-page document on what would have been decided and what would have been the outcome. Unfortunately, in the last day, they had to cut the article-by-article review and water down a lot of recommendations. And so the final report, I think, is 11 pages. So in the span of a few hours, 2/3 of the final document were cut to be able to reach consensus. So things like science and tech review, a cooperation mechanism. In the penultimate document, there was language that they were going to develop a mechanism for cooperation or develop a mechanism for science and tech review. In the final document, it was watered down, and now it's developed with a view of establishing a mechanism for cooperation or for science and tech development, which was very disappointing because the strength of the language really reflects how much faith they have in the decision. And the fact that it was watered down shows that states parties were not ready to make concrete decisions, and they were achieving consensus by deferring decisions into the future. So apart from that, there was also no endorsement of the Tianjin biosecurity guidelines, which were which are a set of code of conduct for life scientists. And if you were at the start of the review conference, it was widely believed that this would be one thing that the review conference would endorse. And even something like what we consider a low-hanging fruit was not endorsed, and that was very disappointing. Apart from that, there was no decision to establish a database for facilitating responses to biological weapons use. That was also a missed opportunity, given that COVID-19 happened, and not saying that that's a bioweapon, but like we need better responses to biological events. And the BWC is supposed to have structure for responding to such events, and a decision to strengthen it was missed, and among others. Yeah. So to be honest, after the review conference, Nils and I were very disappointed at the outcome. I think because we saw the penultimate document and we saw what it could have been. And we spoke to a senior UN official, and what he said to us was like, oh, this was a very positive outcome. We're so happy. We made history in disarmament, and we ended like the year of disarmament on a very positive note. And Nils and I thought he was being sarcastic, and we had to ask him. And it turns out he was genuinely really happy about the outcome. And I think it showed that if you work for disarmament in a very long time, you have to celebrate the small wins. Yeah, so that was very interesting. And now Nils will elaborate more about our reflections from the RAFCON.
Great, thanks, Ryan. So in this section, I'll share some reflections on the intricacies of decision-making and diplomacy. Strategic negotiation in this space impacts how we initiate and manage change. And understanding these dynamics is key to appreciating how progress is driven and that's sometimes stalled at the convention, kind of going off Ryan's point. Now, the somewhat unfortunate reality here is that the course of these negotiations is not always determined by the most rational proposal. Rather, outcomes are influenced by a multitude of different factors that sometimes collectively lead to short-sighted behavior by states parties. So let's look at this through the lens of a specific issue. Now, I'm going to put all of you in the driver's seat here, and we'll walk through this. You're a diplomat in Geneva, and you're assessing a promising proposal like the Tianjin biosecurity guidelines. This was a voluntary code of conduct for life scientists, and it was considered by many to be pretty low-hanging fruit going into the convention. Well, first crucial factor you'll need to consider is who proposes a given initiative. If the United States proposes something, that's seen by some states parties at the convention, for example, as a non-starter. The so-called non-aligned movement or NAM group of countries is considered less biased here. And so influential countries have to be very strategic and careful about how openly they support a specific issue to avoid hijacking an issue or drawing unwanted attention. Now, in the case of Tianjin, this proposal came from China, a NAM country, and it was supported by countries across regional groups. And this is a good sign for a proposal. It's a promising start. The second is the setting in which a proposal is discussed. Now, at the review conference, meetings are generally classified as on or off the record. Now, discussions on a specific issue need to be brought into the formal meeting at some point. And whether a discussion is entered into the record matters. Proposals that are only ever discussed in informal settings will be considered as non-binding and invalid by certain states parties, and that wastes valuable convention time. So that's important to consider. Now, irrespective of merit, first-time proposals are often seen as immature. This is just due to the slow pace of diplomacy, honestly. It usually takes at least 1 to 2 review conferences or 5 to 10 years from a proposal's initial introduction to its potential adoption. Code of conduct discussions at the BWC started way back in 2005, though. And that's a good sign. It means we're dealing with a fairly refined and mature proposal in this case. Now, the timing of discussions is another strategy to be mindful of. Certain countries may attempt to stall progress on an initiative they don't support by introducing many large changes at the last minute or just stalling discussions altogether. Tianjin, however, was raised by several countries in their opening statements, so this is a promising sign. It means there's kind of a collective drive for meaningful action. Lastly, we'll need to be mindful of the coupling of issues. Negotiations often involve package deals or also so-called hostage-taking of issues. Now, some issues become coupled as trade-offs, irrespective of merit, meaning no progress on one issue can occur without progress on another, despite different levels of maturity or detail. At other times, countries might pretend to care about a certain issue in order to claim to give something up during future negotiations without touching issues that they really care about. Now, one such example is the interplay between the Science and Technology Review and an international cooperation mechanism under Article 10. These issues, despite their different levels of details and maturity, often find themselves discussed in tandem or in transactional terms. And this makes progress really difficult because it basically discredits the unique proposal or the unique merits of each proposal. Unfortunately, despite getting through over 2 weeks of the convention relatively unscathed, the Tianjin guidelines became coupled to contentious text in a paragraph of the convention that could not be agreed upon during the last days of the review conference. It thus became collateral damage and did not make it into the final document. Now, negotiations require sacrifices, and this proposal will be brought up again, I'm sure. Sometimes it's necessary to accept these losses to focus on what is more important and ensure that a final agreement is reached. This is just one example of a proposal that made it relatively far. There's a multitude of other proposals, some of which Ryan mentioned, that failed at all stages of this process. What I want to illustrate here is just the multifaceted and dynamic nature of these negotiations. There is a trade-off here between a globally recognized norm and the pace of progress when you hand 185 countries veto power on an agreement, right? I mean, those are often not compatible. Yeah, in many cases, the common denominator on these issues, especially given a challenging geopolitical backdrop, is just frustratingly small, and you've got to work with what you got. There we go. So I want to pivot now briefly to another key aspect of decision-making within the BWC, and that's the oftentimes informal backdrop to the official plenary sessions. Now, official positions within the BWC often display remarkable continuity. Many statements and viewpoints you'll hear in the plenary or in the official meetings are echoes of those delivered years or even decades ago in some cases, and they're very similar to those delivered at UN General Assembly meetings or at intersessional meetings. But it's deceiving because there's a lot of discussion that happens away from the spotlight. Now, it's essential to remember that delegates are bound by instructions from their respective capitals. These form the basis for official positions expressed by state parties during the conference, and time delays in receiving these instructions, often just due to time zones, often means that delegates rarely make a decision on the spot. And this kind of reinforces the importance of informal channels of communication. This brings me to informal meetings. Now, informal meetings are critical. This is where the groundwork for outcomes during the convention is laid. These closed-doors discussions offer space for more flexible maneuvering and discussions without having to worry about saving face necessarily as much in public settings. Now, one example of this is the last night of the review conference. All of us, including states parties, found ourselves shuffled into this room in the basement of the Palais after the official meeting rooms closed. And these discussions lasted well into the night, midnight for most, and some states parties well into the morning. And because of this late hour, there was no interpreters present. So English became the default language, exchanges became much more rapid and informal. There was frequent coffee breaks and trips to the vending machines. And all of these kind of interactions foster fertile ground for mutual personal relationship building. And that is the last point. Yeah, personal relationships matter. These relationships are crucial to building trust and fostering a more nuanced understanding of different viewpoints within the convention, especially for smaller countries where oftentimes one person is dealing with a massive portfolio of disarmament. Now, in the case of the BWC, participants had the opportunity to participate in the Bowling World Cup, the informal BWC. It's one of many initiatives that allowed these informal connections to be made. The reason I'm bringing up this particular initiative is because it's also actually our collective claim to fame as interns, because Barbara, one of the 4 ISU interns, rolled her way to victory over all states parties during the evening in what is probably the most non-politicizing way for that evening to end, and also the most easily reached unanimous decision of the conference. But there's many of these settings, including an official retreat before the conference that's meant to reinforce this. And with that, I'll hand it off to Ryan for some closing thoughts and reflections, and then we'll open it up for Q&A.
Thanks. Yeah, so in conclusion, I'd like to answer the following questions that you might have, which are, why is the BWC important, and how can I contribute to it? I think in our talk, we've talked about how perhaps limited the BWC is, how slow the pace of progress is, and how this might have implications on global biosecurity governance. We don't want to seem too pessimistic, because we do believe that the BWC is very critical in global biosecurity governance. It is important as a marker to uphold norms against biological weapons use. It is a reminder that 185 states parties came together to agree that the use of biology as a weapon is repugnant to the conscience of mankind. It remains the only global forum that states parties get to meet with academics, technical experts, and NGOs to come together in the global forum to discuss ways to strengthen the convention. And it's foundational for a legally binding treaty. If we ever do get to a point where the BWC has the same infrastructure as the Chemical Weapons Convention, it has to spring out of the BWC. The progress can be very incremental, and it can be very discouraging. Like, it took 16 years to decide to add 1 staff member to the 3-person secretariat. So that is extremely slow and extremely discouraging to some people, but we think it's better than the treaty becoming forgotten or regressing. And yeah, like I said, if we work in disarmament long enough, we need to celebrate the small wins, yeah? And I also want to reassure people that, like, the BWC remains very weak. That is a position held by some people. But it might be the most important thing that we have in global biosecurity governance, but it's by no means the only entity and the only mechanism that we have to drive global biosecurity. There are a lot of other organizations and initiatives like IBIS by the Nuclear Threat Initiative, the Global Health Security Agenda, and even work by regional groups like the EU and ASEAN can have a lot to do in advancing biosecurity globally. So even if the BWC remains the way it is, the gaps can be filled by other means. Yeah, so don't worry. Yeah, so yeah, if you're interested in contributing to the BWC, there are a few ways. I think internships like what Nils and I have done are great if resources are available. And it's a really interesting way for early career people like us to have impact. For preparations for the 9th Review Conference, we had to write policy briefs about different proposals that were on the table at the review conference, and the interns were like slogging away at this, and we presented it to the president of the review conference. And it turns out that the UN Undersecretary General for Disarmament Affairs also read these policy briefs, and this also helped in the negotiation process. So we didn't expect that to happen. And the internships are also like a low-cost way to test your fit in biorisk mitigation, especially those with, who are interested in learning more about policy-oriented approaches. There are other ways to get involved apart from doing an internship. One way is to actually attend BWC meetings, and a lot of people don't know that they can actually do that. But if you register with an NGO, you can attend as an NGO delegate. And some people in this room have also attended it during the review conference. Another way is to take part in the Youth for Biosecurity Fellowship that the Office for Disarmament Affairs organizes, that targets people at lower middle income countries and gives them the opportunity to engage with the convention and attend conference meetings as well. And Nils and I are having office hours in the hour after this to talk about applying to the BWC internship and what day-to-day looked like during the internship. I think the venue is actually here instead of Quayside 2, so yeah. Lastly, we want to thank the BWC ISU and people who've helped us with our talk, including Tessa Alexanian and Lauren Garlick. And if you're interested in following more about BWC, here are some Twitter, if you still use Twitter, here are some accounts you can follow. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ryan and Nils. That was a really comprehensive and insightful perspective, and a lot of some of the backdoor stuff that you're involved in, and all the exciting developments that happened last year at RepCon as well. We do have some time for more questions, so feel free to drop them in the swap card, and I'll pick them up. The first question I kind of wanted to open up with, Nils, you in particular mentioned the idea that the penultimate document had to be dropped in order to reach a consensus. Could you just elaborate a bit more on what are the dynamics involved there, and what are some expected outcomes you wished had happened that were missed out, unfortunately? Sure,
yeah, I'd be happy to. I mean, the honest truth is that a lot of these negotiations, especially in like the final hour, happen behind closed doors. So it can be difficult to get a precise understanding, and there was definitely several states parties that were kind of left wondering, you know, or not states parties even, but also just private sector NGO players that were kind of left wondering, well, what happened to this proposal that was in the document, you know, 48 hours before the end of the conference? So everything you hear is kind of through informal channels. I do just think that sometimes in these settings, there's this like tit for tat negotiation, right? Where it's like, this is part of a paragraph that cannot be agreed to by a certain country. And then it becomes a matter of like, well, if you can't agree to it, we just got to remove it. And then if there is an initiative like Tianjin in this paragraph, then I mean, collateral damage in the honest sense of the word, it just doesn't make it into the final document. A few other initiatives that I think Ryan mentioned as well, where there was kind of a proposal to flush out Article 7. So this would be the response to a biological weapons incident. There's currently very little framework in place as to well, what does a response look like, especially kind of divvying up responsibility between WHO and other international organizations. And then, I mean, if you want to talk about some other proposals that we were feeling pretty optimistic on.
We were also very optimistic about having a science and tech review mechanism. This has been something that we've talked about for decades. The fact is that, like I said, the Biological Weapons Convention was negotiated in 1975. The threats from biology were very different from what they are now, and the threats right now are continuing to evolve very quickly. And having a convention that, even if it made a decision every 5 years, that would be something that would be good, right? But it doesn't even have that. Like, there's no mechanism in the convention to update its understanding of science and tech, and how science and tech can even help with things like verification in the treaty. So it was quite disappointing because the facilitator in charge of science and tech review actually came up with very elaborate procedures and elaborate reports detailing how a science and tech mechanism could have been established. And these are all on the meetings documents on the 9th Review Conference website. But despite how mature the policy is, it was ultimately not agreed upon because it is seen something as like a Western group proposal, or it's widely supported by developed countries. And there's a sense that like developing countries view science and tech review as a way to stifle the bioeconomy and innovation in these countries. And so it often is discussed in tandem with the cooperation mechanism, which is seen as one way that tech transfer can happen. And because the cooperation mechanism wasn't agreed upon, neither was the science and tech review.
Right, thank you for sharing that. Just building a bit more, you mentioned like a lot of the important discussions sometimes happen during informal meetings and sort of the backroom conversation. And Ryan, you also touched on the importance that they are done on record, you know, for the purpose of future review and future conferences. But also for people to have more insight on what is being brought up in bio for the rest of the world. Do you have a perspective on what sort of mechanisms or interventions could be useful to help bring some of these backroom conversations to the forefront?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that a lot of this does happen in official settings. I mean, oftentimes these backroom discussions will happen when it's pretty clear that there's disagreement between a small subset of countries, sometimes just 2 countries, right? But because every country has a veto power, that's still a sticking point. And so that will sometimes lead to these late negotiations by a small group in these closed-door meetings to sort out whatever needs to be sorted out and see if a consensus can be reached. The majority of these discussions happen in kind of official settings that are often live streamed on UN TV or that NGOs would have access to. And so I would say it's a minority. I mean, obviously in like the final hours of the conference, like this maybe happens a little bit more often, but like the vast majority of the conference is like publicly accessible overall.
Ryan, do you have thoughts on that?
I think the review conference, the 9th review conference, was organized by the Permanent Mission of Italy, and I think they've done a very good job. The president of the review conference, His Excellency Leonardo Bencini, and his team did a very good job of organizing discussions, and whenever there were clear disagreements, he would call for smaller meetings with the interested parties to try to reach a negotiations, and these meetings often happen in the back room behind the actual room itself, so when you see people are missing, you have a guess of where they are. My point is to say that the composition and the strength of the organizing permanent mission has a big part to play in whether decisions are made and whether, consensus can be achieved.
Got you. Thank you for sharing that. Another question that I think everybody in the audience is quite interested in, what are some future prospects you seek for what a verification mechanism could look like? And in more detail, like what do you anticipate the current biggest barrier or bottlenecks to achieving that would be?
That is
super
a million-dollar
broad
question. I mean, I think it's a big deal that it's even being discussed. So kind of, these discussions happened in 2001. The treaty was very close to adopting an official verification protocol. These documents are all public. I mean, there's hundreds of pages of kind of working through what inspections could look like and confidence building measures. And ultimately, there was kind of last minute changes of positions by the United States and also other countries expressed, kind of questioned the proceedings. A lot of the challenge just comes down to different countries understand different things under verification, and sometimes even just like that terminology can be hard to reconcile. So for some countries in the Western group, verification is a very narrow term. Verification means you can leave a country with no shred of a doubt that no offensive biological weapons capability is being developed. But when you're talking about a technology that's like so inherently dual use, that's almost never the case. And so that's where some of these countries would draw the line and say, there is no possibility for a verification mechanism. There's only possibility for like transparency, enhancing measures, kind of more disclosure. And then the other end of the spectrum is there is certain countries who say, well, we can't meaningfully implement actions with our government unless we have a legally binding protocol, unless we have verification, we can kind of prove that that this treaty has teeth. So that can be really hard to reconcile. What the specifics look like, I'm really not sure. I mean, this is, I don't know if you have more. I mean, this is the first time it's being discussed. I'm very kind of excited to see what gets brought up, if they use kind of previous discussions as a starting point, or if they kind of start over. I mean, 2001 was a long time ago. I'm sure things have changed. Yeah.
Yeah, I think looking at how science and technology has developed in the last 2 decades since the negotiations fell through, I think a lot of new technology can be incorporated to develop a verification protocol. So no verification outcome is going to be 100% evidence for non-compliance or the development of biological weapons. But I think technologies like open source intelligence, which can like peek behind the curtain to see whether some activities are suspicious or not, that's quite interesting. And another technology is also genetic engineering attribution. I think at its current stage, it's not really practical, but in the future, when it gets more legitimate and it becomes more effective, genetic engineering attribution could be one evidence that's presented when it comes to making a decision about whether a state party is complying with the Biological Weapons Convention.
Yeah, and I would agree that it's important that we take steps now, given the complexity of what biotech looks like. In the next 10 years, it's going to be much higher than what we're dealing with right now, barely dealing with right now. You also remarked that BWC also takes into consideration what NGOs and the civil society puts on the agenda, and that is really interesting and good to hear. What role do you anticipate the civil society plays in what BWC prioritizes or puts on their agenda going forward?
I think a lot of it is just raising the issue to the forefront, to the mainstream. I mean, I think it's pretty remarkable when you think of like the attention that has shifted to this issue over the past 2 decades. I think it's kind of interesting to look back when we were talking about verification in 2001, right? I mean, effectively nobody cared. I mean, there was barely any attention on this issue. Definitely like no press, really. And we were really close. I mean, that was years of protocol negotiations. So if you compare that to now, now we have room shortages at the BWC because there's so many NGOs that want to come. We had in the 40s, I think, want to participate in the 9th, or come to participate in the 9th Review Conference. And so like that in the span of 2 decades is really encouraging. I think there is a space for these organizations to both like fill gaps, kind of show that new methodologies of like attribution or certain things that change the risk calculus are possible, and make it harder for diplomats to say no to some of these technologies, right? I mean, you can show that certain things are possible. And then, yeah, I mean, they can just, I mean, especially in democracies, right, increase attention, they can hold decision makers to account and just gradually try to move the needle and show that people care about this.
Yeah, I think civil society, including academics and technical experts, are an invaluable part of the conversation, because if you count them out of if you look into the room at the 9th Review Conference and you discount the NGOs, you're left with the delegates who are mostly political, have political science backgrounds or like law, international relations. Most of them are not scientists, and therefore they don't really understand maybe it's a bit harsh, but I guess a lot of the nuances about scientific research and the threats that biology poses probably evade them. And so it's important to have technical experts being part of the conversation. And I'm excited that the current working group seems to be open to both like delegates and also technical experts, because in the past intersessional program from 2017 to 2021, they had meetings of states parties and meetings of experts. Meetings of states parties were attended to by members of the permanent missions and state representatives, and meetings of experts were attended by like scientists and technical experts who actually knew what they were, these scientific advances or what was scientifically possible. I think part of what was a bit let down was that because it was split into these 2 types of meetings, very few of the insights that were gained in the meetings of experts filtered to the meetings of states parties. So whatever decision they made wasn't really informed by the science. So with this working group, I hope that there's a better integration of discussions.
Certainly, and working groups are invaluable driving agenda forward. So I'll personally also be excited to see that. Just to close this session on sort of a positive note, so we have lots of growing EA talent who's interested in bio from different angles and spaces. And I know we previously separately spoken about the need for diversity from engineering backgrounds, biological science background, even political science backgrounds to go into bio going forward. What are some recommendations that you have for how people interested in the scale of BWC could look into or research more into as sort of maybe low effort or concrete next steps?
Do you want to take this one first? Or?
Yeah, I think, yeah, as someone, I am an early career, yeah. Early career people, I think it's important to, I think it's great that the field of biorisk mitigation is so broad that it accepts talents from different areas, and it's really about finding how your niche and how your skill set contributes to a particular niche. I think skills that are commonly needed by anyone, regardless of their skill set, are communication and writing, and this is something that we found to be quite invaluable during our internship when we had to condense policy ideas into 2-page briefings, and just synthesizing information and presenting it is a very important skill. And one thing, the only way to do that is, the only way to build up that skill is really to practice. And to that end, I recommend people look into their various policies that they might be interested in biosecurity governance, and an opportunity to do this in a more structured manner is the Nuclear Threat Initiative's Next Generation for Biosecurity competition, which is a good opportunity to do a very focused research essay and have it looked at by esteemed judges.
Yep. yeah, I would echo that. I mean, there's a lot of fellowships out here. There's a lot of opportunity boards that would highlight these opportunities. Much like Ryan said, I mean, this is a problem that affects all of us, and I think there's room for just pretty much every background to contribute to this. I think it's also notable that, I mean, the US and probably some other major players are outliers in the sense of how much resources they can dedicate to these problems. You know, there is a non-negligible group of diplomats who attend these conferences who you know, can afford to care about biological weapons for like 3 or 4 weeks out of the year, right? And the rest of the time they're traveling to, they're doing Chemical Weapons Convention, they're doing Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and so on. And so I think depending on where you live, the threshold to like meaningfully contribute or like kind of look at, you know, what has your country supported in the past, or is like relatively low. And even in the US, you know, the team would say that it's probably not enough, right? I mean, there's always room for contribution. So yeah, I would see that as like both scary but like encouraging, right, for people to get involved. Yeah, happy to talk more about that in office hours as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. As they both mentioned, they will be staying in this room afterwards. So if you do have any more questions, please do come forward and ask them. But yeah, I just want to say thank you from our like EA community side. We have you both in the community to share your experiences with us and to kind of guide steps forward. And with that, can we get a huge round of applause for both Nils and Ryan?